Friends and colleagues, let me begin with a blunt, unavoidable hook. Imagine, for the sake of urgent public analysis, a single night so catastrophic that it reshapes a region's politics, economies, and human lives for decades. Imagine voices across continents waking to a headline that claims tens of thousands of soldiers dead and alliances rearranged overnight. We must treat such a scenario with two simultaneous responses. First, the human response of sorrow and outrage at any loss of life. Second, the analytical response that asks how and why such a calamity could happen, who benefits, and how ordinary people can prevent further catastrophe. Allow me to be explicit. I do not assert that the headline in question is factual. What I do insist on is this: whether real, rumored, or weaponized as propaganda, the image of a region suddenly plunged into unprecedented violence demands sober, systemic explanation. When states like Iran, Turkey, or Qatar appear in headlines about coordinated military action, we need to move beyond sensationalism and toward diagnosing underlying political economies, state interests, regional rivalries, economic pressures, and the networks of alliances that make mass force conceivable. First, consider the material roots. War is bought, planned, and executed by institutions embedded in economic systems. Militaries consume budgets that are appropriated from societies, industries that profit from armaments lobby for escalation, and elites sometimes use external conflict to distract from domestic economic distress. If an attack on this scale were to occur, we would have to follow the money and logistics, procurement channels, intelligence sharing, supply lines, and the economic incentives that align private contractors with state objectives. That is the terrain where decisions are actually made. Second, examine the politics of alliances. Geopolitics is never simply a story of spontaneous friendship or enmity. Nations act on perceived gains, security, influence, economic access, or the suppression of internal dissent. An ostensible coalition of states would reflect converging calculations, some public, many covert. But coalitions are fragile and often come with contradictory aims. Those contradictions determine whether an event spirals into wider war or collapses into strategic posturing and propaganda. Third, consider the human cost and the moral economy. Tens of thousands of lives lost in a single night, whether soldiers or civilians caught in the aftermath, is not an abstract statistic. Families, neighborhoods, and entire local economies would be destroyed. Moreover, the aftermath would create refugee flows, deepen poverty, and empower reactionary forces at home and abroad. Any analysis that ignores the immediate human suffering is an analysis that fails its first duty. Fourth, think about the propaganda dynamics. In an age of rapid, viral disinformation, dramatic casualty claims can be weaponized to justify retaliation, curtail civil liberties, or rally populations behind leaders who promise security at the cost of democracy. We must therefore demand independent verification, challenge unilateral narratives, and protect spaces for journalism and civil society to report facts without being co-opted. Fifth, there are global economic ripple effects. A sudden, large-scale conflict in a geopolitically central region would disrupt energy markets, shipping lanes, and financial confidence. Those disruptions disproportionately harm working people. Rising prices for necessities, unemployment from halted trade, and austerity measures imposed to service military spending. The burdens of war are rarely borne by the powerful who promote it. They fall on ordinary people already struggling to survive. So what should our political response be? First, refuse to accept persistent fear as a mandate for surrendering democratic rights. Second, insist on rigorous multi-source verification of all casualty and action reports. Third, mobilize international diplomacy immediately, not as a platitude, but as a practical set of steps: emergency humanitarian corridors, neutral fact-finding missions, and multilateral mediation channels that include voices from civil society and labor organizations. Fourth, apply pressure to cut the economic engines of escalation, sanctions targeted at profiteers who fund war, limits on arms flows that bypass oversight, and transparent audits of military budgets. Finally, for those of us who think in Marxian terms, view this crisis as a moment that reveals class structures and state interests. If political elites use foreign conflict to mask domestic failures, from unemployment to housing crisis, then the remedy must include both peace diplomacy and intensified domestic struggle for social justice. The working class, here and everywhere, has the greatest interest in preventing conscription into endless cycles of violence and in redirecting public resources toward health, education, and livelihoods. In closing, another direct hook: do not let headlines substitute for judgment. Whether the event you read about tonight is real, exaggerated, or deliberately misleading, our obligation is to mourn human loss, demand the truth, and act to prevent escalation that multiplies suffering. The real power belongs not to the architects of war, but to citizens who insist on transparency, accountability, and policies that protect life and dignity. Let us use whatever influence we have as voters, organizers, journalists, and neighbors to push for de-escalation, verification, and a politics that places human needs above geopolitical spectacle. Thank you. Imagine waking up to a headline that claims 70,000 soldiers of one of the most technologically advanced armies in the world have been killed in a single night. The sheer magnitude of such a figure immediately seizes attention, not simply because of its brutality, but because it would represent a rupture in the very fabric of modern warfare. Wars today are fought with precision, guided munitions, satellite intelligence, and highly coordinated operations designed to minimize mass battlefield losses. The idea that so many trained, armed, and equipped soldiers could be wiped out in a matter of hours forces us to question the credibility, the intent, and the consequences of such a claim, and that is where the real analysis must begin. First, consider the historical scale. Even in some of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century, Stalingrad, Kursk, or the trench slaughter of World War I, casualty numbers rarely reached such astronomical figures in such compressed timeframes. 70,000 in a single night would rival or surpass entire campaigns fought over months. When a claim defies historical precedent, it demands forensic examination. How exactly would this have been possible? What weapons could achieve it? What breakdown in defense systems could allow such an unprecedented disaster? The hook here is that we are not merely talking about numbers on a page, we are talking about the plausibility of one of the greatest military collapses in modern memory. Second, such a claim functions as a political weapon. Numbers in wartime are rarely neutral, they are chosen, reported, and amplified with intent. If the figure is inflated, the motive may be psychological, meant to terrify adversaries, to embolden allies, or to showcase a sudden and decisive superiority. If, however, there is truth to it, the intent shifts to demonstrating strength through fact. Either way, the numbers themselves become part of the battlefield, circulating across social media, repeated in newsrooms, and shaping the perceptions of millions before they are ever verified. In a digital age where narratives travel faster than bullets, casualty reports can destabilize politics as effectively as any missile strike. Third, consider the human dimension. To speak of 70,000 soldiers is to speak of 70,000 families, communities, and networks suddenly shattered. Each soldier is embedded in a web of relationships, parents, children, partners, colleagues, whose lives would be torn apart by grief and shock. The psychological toll inside Israel, were such a loss genuine, would be almost unimaginable. A nation that has long prided itself on security, military preparedness, and intelligence superiority would be facing the collapse of a central narrative that its defense forces are not only strong, but nearly invincible. This hook is not about abstract numbers, it is about the unraveling of collective confidence, the erosion of trust in leadership, and the seeding of fear across society. Fourth, we must weigh the strategic consequences. A loss of this magnitude would cripple any army, leaving borders vulnerable, operations suspended, and command structures in chaos. Rivals in the region would interpret such weakness as an opening, potentially triggering further escalations or opportunistic strikes. Meanwhile, allies would be forced into difficult decisions. Do they double down on support, risking being pulled into a spiraling conflict, or do they step back, seeking to limit their own exposure? Either choice reveals how numbers on a casualty report ripple outward, altering diplomatic alignments and reshaping international strategies overnight. Fifth, the credibility of institutions comes under strain. Governments, militaries, and media all risk being caught in a storm of mistrust. If official figures are too quickly accepted, they may later be exposed as propaganda. If they are dismissed outright, they may turn out to be grounded in fact. Either scenario erodes public faith. People begin to ask, who can we trust for the truth? And once trust collapses, even accurate information struggles to find acceptance. That collapse in credibility is in itself a victory for forces seeking instability, because a society divided over truth is a society weakened from within. Finally, reflect on the wider global audience. To people far removed from the battlefield, such figures are received with a mixture of disbelief, shock, and morbid fascination. They shape the way global citizens talk about the conflict at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media. The figure of 70,000 killed becomes a symbol, not just of war, but of the fragility of peace. And symbols of power, they fuel protests, influence elections, shift economic markets, and harden ideologies. That is why even the possibility of such a loss must be handled with extreme care, because once the image of mass death enters public consciousness, it cannot be easily erased. So the real story behind such a headline is not only whether it is true or false, but how it operates as a force in its own right. The hook is clear. When you hear 70,000 soldiers killed in a single night, you are not just hearing a number, you are witnessing an attempt to shape reality itself, to mold perception into power. And in politics, as in war, perception can be just as lethal as the weapons that fire on the battlefield. Picture for a moment the shockwaves that ripple across the world when three countries, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and complex histories, are suddenly described as uniting against a common target. Iran, Turkey, and Qatar, standing shoulder to shoulder, would represent not just a temporary battlefield alliance, but the outline of a new geopolitical axis, with the potential to reorder the balance of power in the Middle East. This is no small matter. These nations occupy critical strategic terrain, control vast energy resources, and wield considerable influence across the Muslim world. The hook here is stark. When former rivals or uneasy partners find cause to align militarily, it signals more than a local skirmish. It suggests tectonic shifts in global politics. The first question that arises is motivation. Why would Iran, Turkey, and Qatar, countries that do not always see eye to eye, choose to unite? For Iran, the drive is clear: long-standing opposition to Israel and a desire to assert itself as the leading voice of resistance in the region. For Turkey, the calculus is more complicated. It straddles east and west, balancing NATO membership with ambitions of regional leadership. Yet, Ankara has shown a growing willingness to challenge Western dominance when it perceives its national interest threatened or its regional influence diminished. Qatar, on the other hand, often acts as a nimble power broker, using its immense wealth and diplomatic agility to punch far above its weight. For all three, the common thread could be the political and symbolic value of confronting Israel, but their deeper motives are layered in economic, religious, and strategic calculations. What makes this alignment particularly explosive is that it cuts across existing lines of division. Turkey and Iran have historically competed for influence, from Syria to the Caucasus. Qatar has at times leaned closer to Turkey's orbit while maintaining pragmatic ties with Iran. Yet the hook is that in the crucible of crisis, long-standing rivalries can be set aside if the prize is large enough. That prize may be geopolitical leverage against the United States, which has long backed Israel as a cornerstone of its Middle Eastern policy. By appearing united, these three nations send a message not just to Israel, but to Washington, Brussels, and Riyadh. The balance of power is shifting, and new centers of influence are emerging. If such an axis were to materialize, its effects would be profound. Militarily, it would present Israel with a far more complex security dilemma than the localized threats it has faced in the past. Instead of containing sporadic hostilities from one direction, it would be confronted with a coordinated front stretching across multiple borders and supported by diverse logistical networks. Diplomatically, the very existence of such cooperation would challenge the narratives of division within the Muslim world that Western policymakers have often relied upon to prevent unified opposition. Economic. The alignment of an energy powerhouse like Qatar with regional heavyweights like Iran and Turkey could create a potent blend of financial muscle and military capability. Yet, beyond capability lies symbolism. The image of three Muslim majority nations uniting against Israel carries immense resonance across the Arab and Islamic worlds. It feeds into long-standing grievances about occupation, displacement, and Western-backed dominance. That symbolism can ignite popular mobilizations, inflame protests, and reshape public discourse across the region. The hook here is that alliances are not only about tanks and planes, they are about hearts and minds, about who claims the mantle of leadership in a narrative of justice and resistance. Of course, unity on paper does not always translate into unity on the battlefield. Diverging interests, fragile trust, and internal pressures could easily fracture such a coalition. Iran's revolutionary ideology, Turkey's pragmatic nationalism, and Qatar's opportunistic diplomacy do not naturally align. Yet even the temporary perception of unity can be enough to alter calculations. Israel would have to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Its allies would be forced into reassessment, and regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and Egypt would have to weigh whether to confront, accommodate, or exploit this emerging axis. The international dimension cannot be ignored. Russia, with ties to both Iran and Turkey, might welcome such a development as a way to weaken U.S. influence. China, hungry for secure energy supplies and eager to expand its Belt and Road Initiative, could view the Axis as a stabilizing partner, or at least as leverage against Western strategies. Meanwhile, the United States and its European allies would be confronted with the uncomfortable reality that decades of reliance on divide and rule tactics were unraveling before their eyes. In the end, the mere suggestion of Iran, Turkey, and Qatar uniting to strike Israel is powerful enough to change conversations in boardrooms, parliaments, and military command centers. Whether or not the alliance holds or even fully materializes, the perception of a new bloc is itself a weapon. The hook is that power in today's world is not only about what you can actually do, it is about what others believe you might be capable of doing. And in politics, perception can be the difference between deterrence and disaster. Imagine for a moment the psychological impact on a nation when the foundation of its security narrative is suddenly shaken to its core. For decades, Israel has built its identity not only around survival, but around the projection of military strength, discipline, and superiority. The Israeli Defense Forces are not simply a national institution, they are the very symbol of the state's ability to endure in a hostile region. Now imagine headlines declaring that 70,000 soldiers were killed in a single night, whether true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated. The effect of such a claim would be nothing short of seismic. It would pierce through the armor of confidence that the government, the military, and the public have carefully cultivated over generations. The hook here is simple yet devastating. When the backbone of national security appears broken, even temporarily, the entire body of society trembles. Consider first the sheer scale of the alleged loss. 70,000 soldiers is not just a military statistic, it is the size of a city, a generation of young men and women trained, armed, and believed to be part of an unbeatable machine. In one night, that machine would be portrayed as vulnerable, overwhelmed, and defeated. Even if the reality were different, the perception itself is enough to trigger widespread panic, mistrust, and despair. Families would flood military offices demanding answers. Citizens would look to leaders and ask the unthinkable: how did this happen? What went wrong? And most dangerously of all, can the state still protect us? The political consequences would follow almost immediately. Israel's government, already under constant domestic pressure, would face a crisis of legitimacy unlike any in its history. Opposition parties would seize on the catastrophe to demand accountability, while sitting leaders would scramble to contain not only the external threat, but the internal implosion of confidence. In a democracy that is deeply divided on many social and political issues, such a colossal shock could deepen fractures, paralyze decision-making, and even lead to mass protests in the streets. The hook here is that military defeat, real or perceived, does not only weaken armies, It destabilizes governments, redraws political maps, and forces nations into dangerous periods of uncertainty. Strategically, Israel's deterrence doctrine would be in jeopardy. The country's security has long rested on convincing its enemies that any attempt to inflict harm would be met with overwhelming retaliation. If that image of dominance is shattered, if even the possibility of mass vulnerability is believed, then deterrence collapses. Rivals, emboldened by Israel's apparent weakness, might test the waters further, escalating attacks, probing defenses, and seeking to capitalize on the psychological advantage. Deterrence is not built on weapons alone, it is built on reputation, and a single night that calls that reputation into question can undo decades of carefully crafted image. This also has implications for Israel's alliances. The United States, Europe, and other partners provide support to Israel partly on the assumption that it is a reliable, effective, and resilient ally in a volatile region. If reports of catastrophic loss spread unchecked, even before verification, Israel's allies would be forced into difficult conversations. Should they deepen their commitments to prove solidarity, or should they quietly reconsider their reliance on a partner that suddenly seems less stable? Either path is fraught with risks. Meanwhile, adversaries such as Iran or groups across the region would seize the moment to portray Israel as weakened, using the narrative to rally supporters, recruit fighters, and justify further escalation. Beyond geopolitics, the societal cost of such an event would be immeasurable. Israeli society is unique in its close connection to the military. Most citizens have served, many have children or siblings in uniform, and the army is woven into the cultural fabric of the nation. To suggest that 70,000 soldiers were lost is to suggest that nearly every family has been touched by grief. Even if exaggerated, the fear of such loss spreads like wildfire, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and despair. Schools, workplaces, and communities would all feel the weight of that fear. The hook here is that fear itself becomes a weapon, one that can weaken a society without a single shot being fired. Finally, the global stage cannot be ignored. For decades, Israel has positioned itself as both a victim of hostile neighbors and a model of resilience in the face of adversity. A narrative of catastrophic loss undermines that image and shifts global debates. Critics of Israel's policies would argue that its power is waning, while supporters would scramble to defend its reputation. International organizations might call for ceasefires, humanitarian interventions, or diplomatic shifts, all influenced by the perception that Israel's security bubble has burst. In the court of global opinion, numbers matter as much as missiles, and the number 70,000 is powerful enough to dominate headlines for years. The larger truth here is that Israel, like any nation, depends on the perception of security as much as the reality of it. The hook is undeniable. When a country's enemies can convince the world, and its own people, that its defenses have failed catastrophically, they achieve a victory far greater than what weapons alone can deliver. It is not only the battlefield that matters, but the battle for perception, and in that struggle, even unverified claims can shake a nation to its core. Think about how wars are no longer fought solely with bombs, tanks, or missiles, but with words, numbers, and images that spread faster than any artillery shell could ever travel. In today's digital battlefield, propaganda and information warfare often determine the outcome before soldiers even engage. A headline claiming 70,000 Israeli soldiers killed in a single night is not just a report, it is a weapon. It strikes at perception, morale, and psychology, and in many cases, perception is more powerful than reality. The hook here is stark. In the 21st century, truth itself has become contested ground, and whoever controls the narrative controls the war. The first thing to grasp is that casualty figures are not neutral. They are deliberately chosen, emphasized, and repeated to create impact. A number as large as 70,000 is designed to shock, to overwhelm the imagination, to plant a sense of inevitability about defeat. Even if the number is exaggerated or entirely false, the act of publicizing it shapes the conversation. Citizens, journalists, and even foreign governments may treat it as fact long before verification catches up. And once a number enters public consciousness, it is remarkably difficult to erase. This is why information has become one of the most effective weapons of modern conflict. It shapes what people believe, and what people believe drives how they act. Consider the role of social media. Within minutes of such a claim being released, it would be shared across platforms, trending in multiple languages, amplified by bots, and discussed by millions of people who lack the tools to verify it. Videos, images, and fabricated testimonies could be attached to the claim, lending it the appearance of authenticity. In the echo chambers of digital networks, repetition can substitute for evidence. The hook here is chilling. In a world of viral information, lies can achieve the speed of truth, and speed often matters more than accuracy. Governments understand this dynamic all too well. Israel would immediately scramble to counter the narrative, issuing statements, mobilizing spokespeople, and pressuring allies to reject the claim. Meanwhile, those who benefit from the story's circulation, whether state actors or non-state groups, would double down, providing evidence to bolster the narrative and casting doubt on official denials. The battlefield then shifts from physical territory to the terrain of credibility. Which side do people trust? Whose voice seems more believable? That contest of credibility can decide whether populations remain confident in their leaders or spiral into fear and unrest. The consequences are not abstract. If Israeli citizens believe such a figure, even temporarily, the effect on morale would be devastating. Families with soldiers in the field might assume the worst. Markets could react in panic, with investors pulling back and currency values dropping. Political opposition could accuse the government of hiding the truth, sowing deeper division in a society already under pressure. Meanwhile, abroad, Israel's adversaries would celebrate, claiming proof of weakness, while allies would hesitate, uncertain whether the state they support is as resilient as it once seemed. The hook is sharp. Information warfare does not just spread confusion, it has material consequences in economics, politics, and public trust. We must also recognize how information warfare blurs the line between journalism and propaganda. Independent journalists may try to report the facts, but when casualty numbers are inflated or denied, even the most careful reporting can be weaponized. A headline taken out of context can fuel anger, protests, or retaliatory action. In such an environment, truth is not just elusive, it is actively under attack. The result is that people begin to distrust all sources, leaving a vacuum where conspiracy theories thrive. And in that vacuum, extremists on every side find fertile ground to spread their message. Internationally, casualty claims of this magnitude can shift diplomatic dynamics. Foreign governments may call for emergency meetings at the United Nations, push for ceasefires, or reconsider their alliances, all based on figures that might not even be accurate. Once a number like 70,000 circulates, it becomes part of the political landscape, shaping policy discussions and influencing decisions, even if it is later disproven. The irony is that by the time the truth emerges, the damage is already done. The hook here is sobering. In propaganda wars, the first story often becomes the lasting story, no matter how false it may be. Ultimately, the use of exaggerated or fabricated casualty numbers reveals how war has evolved. It is no longer enough to win battles on the ground. Nations and movements must also win the battle for hearts and minds. The most devastating strike may not be a missile, but a headline that convinces millions that defeat is inevitable. And once that belief takes root, it can be harder to dislodge than any entrenched enemy on the battlefield. The hook is unmistakable in an era where narratives kill as effectively as weapons. Controlling information is not a side strategy, it is the war itself. Picture a sudden escalation in the Middle East, one so dramatic that it is said to involve tens of thousands of casualties overnight. Beyond the battlefield, beyond the headlines, what happens next is a shockwave that reaches into boardrooms, marketplaces, and households thousands of miles away. Wars today do not remain confined to the countries in which they are fought. They spill across oceans through energy markets, financial systems, and supply chains. A claim that 70,000 soldiers were killed in one night does not only ignite fear in military circles, it ignites volatility in the global economy. The hook here is clear. In a world so interconnected, A war in one region is never just that region's war. Start with energy. The Middle East is not just a theater of conflict, it is the beating heart of global oil and gas supply. Iran, Qatar, and Turkey each sit astride critical energy pathways, and any hint of coordinated action that destabilizes the region threatens to choke the arteries of world commerce. Traders do not wait for confirmed reports, they react instantly to rumors and headlines. A sudden claim of catastrophic loss in Israel, paired with the suggestion of a new anti-Israel axis, would drive oil prices up overnight. That spike would not stop at the stock exchange. It would flow directly into the price of gasoline, heating, electricity, and transport around the world. Families in New York, London, Mumbai, and Lagos would feel the costs of a war they are not fighting. This is why casualty figures, whether real or exaggerated, are not just statistics. They are market triggers. Investors interpret them as signals of instability, betting on scarcity and hedging against risk. Stock markets in Tel Aviv could plummet, but the ripple does not end there. European exchanges, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy flows, would also tumble. Asian markets, tied to shipping lanes that pass through the Gulf, would tighten in anticipation of higher transport costs. The hook is that a number printed in a war report can wipe billions off the value of global markets in minutes. Then comes the matter of currency. Israel's shekel, already sensitive to political shocks, would face intense downward pressure. But beyond Israel, currencies of energy, importing countries would also face strain as they scramble to cover rising costs. The US dollar, often a safe haven in crisis, might rise in the short term, making imports more expensive for developing countries. What begins as a regional clash quickly turns into a global redistribution of economic pain, and those least responsible for the conflict, ordinary workers and consumers far from the battlefield, pay the highest price. Think too about supply chains. Modern economies depend on seamless flows of goods, many of which pass through or depend on Middle Eastern stability, from oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz to liquefied natural gas shipments from Qatar. Disruption in this region means disruption everywhere. Container shipping rates could soar, delays could multiply, and industries from aviation to agriculture would feel the crunch. In such moments, the battlefield extends into supermarket shelves and factory floors, where shortages and inflation spark frustration and unrest. The hook is sharp. A single night of violence can translate into weeks or months of higher bills for families half a world away. But perhaps the most insidious effect is psychological. Economic actors, consumers, businesses, and governments operate not just on facts but on expectations. The belief that a war could spiral out of control is often enough to trigger conservative behavior. Households cut spending, businesses postpone investment, and governments tighten budgets. This self-protective instinct can deepen a slowdown into a recession. Even if casualty claims are exaggerated, their circulation creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison to economies. Fear itself becomes a kind of invisible tax, draining confidence and slowing growth. It is also crucial to see who profits from this chaos. Defense contractors benefit from rising military budgets. Energy companies see revenues surge as prices climb. Speculators in financial markets make fortunes betting on volatility. Meanwhile, ordinary workers, those filling their cars, paying their bills, or buying groceries, absorb the costs. This disparity reveals a grim truth war, and its narratives can serve as opportunities for elites, even as they devastate the everyday lives of millions. The hook here is unsettling but undeniable. In the political economy of conflict, suffering is not evenly distributed, it is structured. Finally, we must recognize how governments respond to such economic shocks. Faced with rising prices and public anger, leaders often turn to austerity, cutting social programs to free resources for defense. The burden of war is thus doubled: higher living costs on one side, reduced social support on the other. Citizens who had no say in the decisions leading to conflict become the ones who pay for it, not only with their wallets but with their well-being. So when casualty figures as vast as 70,000 are reported, the implications extend far beyond the battlefield. They reverberate through markets, currencies, energy supplies, and the daily lives of people everywhere. The hook is haunting, even if you live thousands of miles from the Middle East, even if you have never set foot in the region, the war will come to you. In your gas tank, in your grocery bill, and in the paycheck that suddenly doesn't stretch as far. That is the hidden cost of conflict in our interconnected world. Imagine for a moment the world waking up to the shocking claim that tens of thousands of soldiers have perished in a single night of war. The headlines scream devastation, and the airwaves are flooded with images and speculation. Yet behind this chaos lies a deeper reality, a humanitarian catastrophe that demands urgent attention, not only from the nations directly involved, but from the international community at large. Numbers of casualties may be debated, propaganda may cloud the picture, but what is not in dispute is that such escalations invariably unleash suffering on a massive scale. Families are torn apart, cities become uninhabitable, and borders strain under the weight of refugees desperately seeking safety. The urgency of diplomacy becomes clear, for every day without negotiation multiplies the human cost. The scale of such a conflict would create ripple effects that go far beyond the battlefield. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, supplies of food and clean water disrupted, and vulnerable populations left without protection. Mothers searching for children, elderly citizens abandoned in the chaos, children growing up to the sound of explosions instead of laughter. These are the images that never make it into the military reports, but form the harsh reality of war. And here is the unsettling hook: while politicians debate strategy and generals calculate troop movements, it is civilians who pay the highest price. War has always had this cruel arithmetic, but in today's interconnected world, its brutality is magnified, its consequences globalized. Refugee flows would intensify rapidly. Consider the impact on neighboring states like Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, already strained with economic and social pressures. A sudden influx of hundreds of thousands, or even millions, would not simply test their humanitarian capacity, it would threaten regional stability itself. Camps would swell beyond capacity, disease could spread unchecked, and resentment might fester among host populations. This is the forgotten battlefield of modern conflict, the humanitarian front line where human dignity and survival are in constant negotiation. And the haunting truth is that without immediate, coordinated international action, this battlefield becomes as devastating as the military one. Diplomacy in such moments is no longer an abstract concept, it is an urgent necessity. The international community, from the United Nations to regional mediators, faces a stark choice: act decisively to de-escalate tensions or watch as the Middle East spirals into a wider war. The involvement of powerful states, whether Iran, Turkey, Qatar, or Israel, raises the stakes exponentially. Each day without dialogue increases the probability of miscalculation, of retaliatory strikes, of a chain reaction that could pull in global powers like the United States, Russia, or China. The question then is not whether diplomacy is needed, but whether it can move fast enough to prevent an irreversible catastrophe. The human face of war, too often overlooked, is also its most persuasive argument for peace. Images of destroyed schools, lifeless children carried through rubble, or families huddled together in basements do what statistics cannot. They pierce the conscience of the world. Yet here lies the paradox. These same images can be weaponized in the battle of narratives. One side points to them as proof of barbarity, the other dismisses them as staged propaganda. Truth becomes the first casualty, and with it, the possibility of genuine empathy. And so the humanitarian crisis does not only devastate lives, it corrodes trust, making diplomatic solutions harder to achieve. But history teaches us that even the bloodiest conflicts have moments where the tide can turn, when leaders are forced to confront the unsustainability of perpetual war. The stakes here are not only for Israelis, Palestinians, or their neighbors. A Middle East in flames destabilizes energy markets, redraws migration patterns, and fuels extremism that does not respect borders. Ordinary citizens in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas will feel the consequences at their gas stations, in their supermarkets, and in their sense of security. The urgency is therefore universal. What happens in Gaza, Tel Aviv, or Tehran will not remain confined there. It will reverberate across the globe. This is why humanitarian intervention and diplomacy are not luxuries, they are imperatives. To ignore them is to gamble with the lives of millions and the stability of nations far beyond the immediate theater of war. If there is one undeniable lesson to take from such a devastating claim of mass casualties, it is this: wars may begin with the clash of armies, but they end only when the cries of civilians are finally heard, and in that truth lies both the horror of the present and the hope of a different future, if the world has the courage to seize it.